Daern, Chapter 2, Flashpoint, Part 4, Revo. Revo dropped to the ground, fur rippling as an arrow whizzed overhead. If I'd been standing, I'd be dead. One of the bandits wasn't so lucky. He yelped once and fell into Sven's arms, a long arrow fletched with white goose feathers protruding from his back. Pull back! Pull back! Cusack yelled. Revo scurried out of the way as more arrows fell among them. The rapid footfalls of the red-haired man who'd led the Mulronio to town were already receding. I can't see them! Where are they? Thorin screamed from the rooftop. He was aiming his own bow into the darkness beyond the smoldering palisade, but it was no use. The white-fletched arrows streaked out of the darkness like shooting stars and landed with uncanny accuracy. Thorin cried out, his bow clattering to the ground beside Revo. An arrow had pierced his right bicep and had continued its flight, pinning his arm to his side. He was struggling to maintain his grip on the peak of the thatched roof with his other arm. Thorin! Yelled Revo, frantically running to a position beneath the injured bowman. He leaned back, bracing himself as best he could. Let go, Thorin! I've got you! Thorin couldn't have held on much longer anyway if he wanted to. With a groan, he released his grip and slid all the way down the steeply peaked roof, straight into Revo. Revo grunted, trying not to collapse under Thorin's weight. Humans were heavier than they looked. Revo slumped Thorin against the side of the building. Thorin was pale under his sweaty brow, and his eyes were squeezed shut in a tight grimace. Are you all right, Thorin? Before he could answer, a deep growling bark came from the opening in the palisade. Revo turned just in time to see an enormous black dog clearing the worst of the coals in a single bound. It went howling down the street, long and sleek without an ounce of fat to disguise its powerful muscles. It sped past Cusack, Sven, and the remaining bandit, who had all taken shelter from the arrows in the alley beside Olga's bar. Revo shook his head irritably, as the dog's single-minded determination washed over his mind, along with Thorin's pain and confusion. Revo focused on the dog. Compared to Thorin and the bandits he had taken out earlier, animals' primitive minds were easy to understand. The dog would stop at nothing to catch its prey, and anyone who got in the way would be torn to pieces. Its baying sent ripples of fear through the town, children's cries mixed with the howls of the hound, forming a discordant wail that chilled Revo to the bone. Revo leaned against the wall of the house, striving to separate his own thoughts from the minds that swirled around him. I am Revo. I am Revo. And just when he started to feel better, he saw a movement in the corner of his eye. The Mulronio were gliding silently through the burnt palisade. The glowing embers gleamed off their leather armor and masks. Gods, please, 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 no, Thorin whimpered beside him as they approached. The two on the flanks carried longbows with arrows nocked. The one in the middle, the only Mulronio who'd taken off his mask, wielded a slim silver sword. His hair was black as coal, flowing unbound down his shoulders, and his skin was the color of pale bronze. His long ears, pointed like knife blades, swept towards the back of his head. Every delicate curve of his face was perfect, forming a pristine symmetry that would stymie even the finest artist to replicate in paint or pen. The effect was mesmerizing. Revo was reminded of the yellow-throated lilies that grew near his family's hunting grounds, beautiful to the eye, but their petals concealed poison within. Murderers! The dog yelled again from somewhere near the village's center. The three elves paused to listen, and that was when Cusack struck. The Eniato sprang out from the alleyway, his long legs driving him forward with frightening speed. Using the full force of his momentum, he lunged straight at the unmasked elf, swinging his sword. The Mulronio brought up his blade, and slid away, deflecting Cusack's deadly downward strike. Gods above, Thorin groaned. They'll kill him. Elves don't take Eniato. They'll kill him. They'll kill us all. Revo started towards the fight, but noticed one of the bowmen aiming a shot at him. He dove behind a market stall. The elf's arrow smashed into the wood, its tip erupting through the other side, inches from Revo's eye. He peeked through the cracks between the planks, and saw that one of the bowmen was keeping watch over his position. Damn, I'm pinned down, but I have to do something. The elven swordsman snarled, barely ducking under a sweeping arc from Cusack. The other bowmen lurked around the edges of the fight, looking for an opening to attack the Eniato from behind. As Cusack tried to keep an eye on all the elves, The swordsman pounced, getting inside the longer guard of the Enieto's blade. Revo cried out as the elf's short sword slid past Cusack's head, trailing a thin line of blood. Cusack barely seemed to register the pain. Instead, his mouth split into a grim smile of countless sharp teeth. He punched with his free hand. The elf wobbled backwards, but quickly regained his balance, easily dodging another swing. They circled each other, looking for an advantage. Cusack was far heavier and stronger, but the elf moved like lightning. The dog howled again, louder than ever, and this time the sound was laced with triumph. A heart-wrenching scream of pain echoed through the streets of Stone's Cradle. The elf swordsman yelled something in his own lilting tongue, and both bowmen broke away, pursuing the howls of the dog. Revo dashed out from where he'd taken cover. He looked for an opening to help Cusack finish off the swordsman, but Elf and Enieto were moving too fast. He saw that the bowmen were disappearing behind a corner down the street. "Go! I have him!" Cusack screeched at Revo. With only a moment's hesitation, Revo sprinted after the elven archers. Behind him, he heard the heavy thud of a body crashing to the ground, but he couldn't stop to see what had happened. "Hunter, help me." The screaming hadn't stopped, but Revo ignored it as best he could. It wouldn't help him now. The sound bounced off the two boulders of Stone's Cradle, making it impossible to tell where it was coming from. At least, that was what he was hoping. If he couldn't find the red-haired man first, there wasn't going to be much he could do against two elves and a dog. He took a deep breath through his nose. An unpleasant mix of sweat, smoke, and blood blanketed the town like smog. Revo took another sniff and found it. The stench of wet dog, along with something rotten. Not meat, no. Vegetation. Swamp. He followed the smell. The sound of yelling was definitely getting louder, and now he could hear foreign words mixed in with the cries of pain. "Uthron, Vani! Uthron!" He spotted the dog. It was in a narrow alley, its tail wagging excitedly as it tugged and tore at something on the ground. Its back arched and it dragged its prey into the open. The dog's jaws were clamped around the redhead's leg. Blood fell to the ground, like fat drops of rain, as the dog shook him. The man fought, screaming and kicking like a rabbit caught in a snare. His fingernails dragged helplessly across the cobbles as he tried to crawl back into the alley. The dog was huge. Revo closed his eyes and tried to slow his breathing. He stretched out his mind's perception, feeling for the dog. Dizziness rushed over him. He was exhausted. Using his mental powers to incapacitate the bandits at the gate had already pushed him beyond his limits. He gathered the dregs of his mental energy and hurled it at the dog. The beast yelped. Revo opened his eyes and saw it release its bite, staggering into the wall of a house. The man scrambled away, but he didn't get far before the dog recovered. It locked its eyes back on its prey, mouth opening wide and dripping with drool and blood. It wasn't enough. Revo flexed his clawed hands. "This is a bad idea." He charged. The dog yipped with surprise as Revo slammed it into the wall. He scratched at the hound as it tried to get away. When that didn't work, the dog spun and clamped its jaws around Revo's shoulder. Revo bared his teeth, snarling. The brute was big and heavy, and had been trained to bite down and never let go. Revo swiped and beat at the dog's face, but even when he grazed its eye, it still wouldn't let go. Revo's pale blue eye was reflected in the dog's deep brown one. He twisted, pain searing through his shoulder, and found the dog's throat. Revo flattened his hand, his sharp nails forming a blade, and stabbed. The life drained from the dog's eye. It slumped to the ground, and Revo cried as the weight of the dog's body dragged on his shoulder. Even in death, the dog wouldn't let him go. Blinking back tears, he pried the jaws open and stumbled back. His shoulder and arms burned where the dog had bitten him. He stared down the alley. The man was still there, on his back, barely holding himself up on his elbows. In the gloom, the man's eyes were about all Revo could see of him. His smell was far more informative. Blood, sweat, and the same rotten plant odor as the dog. He smelled a bit like something that had crawled under a rock to die, but hadn't quite finished yet. "Are you all right?" Revo said, holding out his hand. "Come on, we can't stay here. The elves are—" He reeled with panic as foreign thoughts brushed against his mind. Acaden de Fuega and Rua. Revo's fur stood on end as he heard the creak of steel on leather approaching from behind. The elven bowmen had caught up. Run away. Revo tried to move, but he was frozen. Neheren Kuid. Revo didn't have to understand Elven to grasp the meaning. He could feel the elf's murderous intent as though it were a physical weight. Run! The redhead lurched to his mangled legs with an animalistic snarl, shoving Revo aside as he scrabbled to get at the Morino. The man slammed his palm into the elf's masked face. The second archer jumped back with a startled oath as man and elf struggled, tumbling to the ground. Then there was an awful popping sound, like ice cracking in spring. The elf howled as blood welled up between the man's fingers. Crunch! Revo's mind was empty with shock as the man slowly withdrew his hand from the elf's head. Its eyes were nothing but torn, empty sacks of tissue leaking from the eyeholes of the misshapen mask. Blood oozed from beneath the stiff leather and spread out in a crimson halo. His head had been crushed as though his skull had been no thicker than an eggshell. There was a clatter as the remaining elf dropped his bow beside the body of the dog and ran. Revo could detect none of his previous grace. His head snapped back to the man, who was now reaching for him, his fingers still red with blood. Revo backed away, unnerved by what he had just witnessed. How did you do that? That was when he noticed the ears. The man's auburn hair had been disheveled in the fight, revealing them. They were pointed. What are those? Revo said. Who are you? What are you? The man froze. Revo was so fixated on the ears that he barely heard the man when he finally spoke. His voice was deep and heavy, with the strains of the elven accent. Revo could barely understand him. I'm sorry. The man turned and ran down the street, limping on his ravaged leg. The thought of trying to follow exhausted Revo. I'll just rest for a moment. He sagged to the ground, with only the corpses of the hunting hound and the faceless elf for company. Thanks for listening to Daern, a story in progress. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like. And if you really enjoyed it, consider donating through Patreon. Any amount will go a long way towards helping us bring more content to you. Links to our Patreon and our website are in the description. See you next week, and have a good one.